The courtroom clock ticked with an indifference that matched the morning. Franklin Hayes shuffled through the side doors and county-issued clothes 2 sizes too large. The cuffs at his wrists jingled faintly, like an afterthought. His gait was slow, uneven, not because of age alone, but from the deep toll of service and years lived without proper shelter. Every step whispered pain, long silenced. He did not lift his eyes when addressed. The bailiff announced, Case 19B, City of Ashfield vs. Franklin James Hayes. Charges: trespassing, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. Franklin stood before the bench, stooped, shoulders sunk beneath the weight of a threadbare military coat. Its faded olive hue barely showed the ghost of the 2nd Battalion patch sewn above the heart. He didn't wear medals. He no longer had any, just memories stitched into skin and silence. "State your name for the record," the clerk asked. His voice, raspy and weathered, barely rose. "Franklin James Hayes, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Retired." From the gallery, a few heads turned, puzzled by the juxtaposition. This man? This old, hunched figure with bruises on his cheek and worn-through soles. A Marine? He didn't expect them to believe it. He didn't need them to. Presiding that morning was Judge Caroline Bennett. Known in the county for her fairness, she ran her courtroom with a measured discipline and a quiet moral center. 21 years on the bench, and she had seen every kind of defendant. Hardened criminals, lost teenagers, desperate mothers. But as she flipped through the file marked Hayes, Franklin, her posture began to shift. Her eyes caught a date, April 2004, then a unit designation, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Fallujah. Her fingers stopped turning the pages. Her stomach dropped. There was a name in the file's military section that hadn't crossed her mind in years. Not since the day her family received that final letter. Her brother, Lieutenant Daniel Bennett, had written to their parents from Iraq about a staff sergeant who had dragged him to safety under fire. So the man wouldn't give his own name, just did his job, then disappeared. She had searched for him once, reached out through old contacts, even inquired through the VA. But the trail had gone cold. The Marine Corps said he'd been medically discharged with traumatic injuries and PTSD. After that, nothing. Until now. She raised her gaze and looked at the defendant again. Really looked. Franklin's head was bowed. His hair, streaked with gray, barely covered a series of scars that vanished beneath his collar. His hands, bound at the wrists, trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from what looked like chronic pain. This man had once saved her brother's life, and now he stood before her on trial. The prosecutor began. "Your Honor, the defendant has repeatedly ignored city ordinances regarding loitering behind Jefferson Street Cafe. He was found trespassing behind the property at 12:14 a.m., and when asked to leave, he failed to comply. He has received 2 prior citations this winter." Judge Bennett's voice was calm but cool. "Did he resist?" The responding officer says he was uncooperative. Franklin's eyes finally lifted, not in defiance, but in fatigue. "I asked for 5 more minutes," he said softly, "just to finish half a sandwich. Jimmy, the cook, he leave them out sometimes." "Jimmy, the cook, is not here to testify," the prosecutor snapped. "No, sir," Franklin murmured. Judge Bennett pressed gently. "Why that spot?" Franklin hesitated. "Because the vent blows warm air from the kitchen. And because I know the cook. His father, he served in Desert Storm. Same battalion, different war." "And what about you?" she asked. "Where did you serve?" A pause, not out of pride, but out of something deeper, the weight of memory returning. "Vietnam, 70 to 73. Then again in Iraq, 03 to 05. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines." Silence folded over the room like a blanket pulled tight. Her hands, still gripping the folder, began to shake. Franklin was returned to the defense bench, and a public defender stepped in briefly. Young, overworked, and clearly unprepared. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," he stammered. "I just got pulled from another hearing. I haven't had time to review the file." Judge Bennett leaned back, her voice now quieter, measured, personal. "Does the defendant wish to speak on his own behalf?" Franklin stood, slowly, joints cracking like old wood. "No excuses, ma'am. I've never asked for handouts. I don't panhandle. I don't steal. I just try to stay warm. Most nights, I sleep by the church, but last week they started locking the gates. He paused. I don't want to be here. Court. The shelter. Any of it. I just didn't have another choice. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened. A man in a charcoal gray suit, with polished shoes and a briefcase worn from years of use, strode confidently toward the defense table. His hair was streaked with silver, and his presence filled the space like an incoming tide. Your Honor, he said, placing the briefcase on the table. Alexander Wren, pro bono counsel for Mr. Hayes. My apologies for the sudden appearance. Judge Bennett's eyes narrowed. Mr. Wren, the court was not informed of this arrangement. It's a last-minute development, he said. I respectfully request a recess to confer with my client. She paused, weighed the options, looked again at Franklin Hayes, bewildered, silent. This court is in recess for 15 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Bennett remained seated, her eyes fixed on the file. On the page, with her brother's name. On the faded photocopy of a commendation bearing the phrase, life-saving actions under enemy fire. In her chambers, she opened her bottom drawer, the one with the thing she hadn't touched in years. A photograph, slightly curled, fell into her hands. She and Daniel on the day he was commissioned. He in his dress blues. She in a borrowed cap and gown. Their arms around each other. And beneath that, a yellowed letter. The last one he ever sent. She began to read. Got pinned down again yesterday. Thought that was it. But someone came through the dust and pulled me out. Staff Sergeant Hayes. Refused to give his full name. Told me, get your men out. I'll hold the line. I saw him go back for a wounded kid. Took a round in the shoulder and kept going. Don't know where he ended up. If I make it back, I owe him everything. She closed the letter. Her hand covered her mouth. And for the first time in years, the judge who had never let emotion color her rulings wept. 15 minutes wasn't enough. Not to untangle the years Franklin Hayes had carried alone. Not to explain to his new counsel, Alexander Wren, how a man could go from bronze stars to broken shelters. Not to reconcile the woman behind the bench with the sister who had once clutched her brother's blood-stained letter to her chest, reading his words over and over again by nightlight after the knock at the door. But sometimes, fate doesn't wait for everything to be ready. It simply arrives. When the courtroom resumed, Judge Caroline Bennett's face was composed. But anyone who had watched her for years might have noticed the stillness was different now. Not rigid, but reverent, like standing in the presence of something sacred. Mr. Wren, she began, her voice steady. You've conferred with your client? Wren stood beside Franklin. I have, Your Honor. And with your permission, I would like to submit new evidence and request reconsideration of all charges. The prosecutor, a young man with an impeccable part in his hair and the too polished certainty of someone who had never had to sleep on a bench, rose instantly. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. Overruled, Judge Bennett said, her tone flat but final. Let's hear it. Wren moved with the slow confidence of someone carrying something delicate. He held up a staple packet. Included in this file is Staff Sergeant Franklin Hayes' complete military service record. His commendations span 3 decades. He served 2 full tours in Vietnam and re-enlisted post, 9/11 at the age of 48. He deployed with 2 8 Marines in Iraq. Fallujah, April 2004. Whispers passed through the gallery. The prosecutor shifted. And how is this relevant to a trespassing charge? Wren didn't look at him. He looked at the judge. It's relevant, he said, because this man has been failed by every system we swore would protect him. Then came the moment no one expected. The side door opened again, and 3 uniformed Marines entered the courtroom. A full colonel, a master sergeant, and a young corporal in dress blues. Their presence rippled through the room. Phones were put away. Postures straightened. The clerk stood involuntarily. Judge Bennett nodded once. Colonel Maddox, you may speak. The colonel approached the bench with practiced formality. Your Honor, I appear today on behalf of the United States Marine Corps. Over the past year, our department has undertaken a review of long-overlooked combat commendations from Iraq and Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Hayes was among the most glaring errors. He turned to Franklin. "Sir, your Silver Star was never properly processed. A field report recommending you for the Navy Cross for your actions during the rescue of Lieutenant Daniel Bennett and 6 other Marines was never reviewed due to a filing error during a battalion transfer in 2005. That has now been corrected." The corporal stepped forward, opening a velvet-lined case. Gasps rang out as the colonel announced, "By order of the Secretary of the Navy Cross is hereby awarded posthumously to Staff Sergeant Franklin James Hayes for extraordinary heroism in combat on April 19, 2004. Franklin didn't move. He didn't reach for the medal. He just stood, swaying slightly, hands loose at his sides. Then slowly, he whispered, "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," the colonel replied. "This is overdue, Sergeant." In the gallery, an older man in a VFW jacket stood. "I served with him," he said suddenly. "He went back twice, under fire to pull out men he didn't even know. Took shrapnel and wouldn't leave the field hospital until every man was accounted for." Another man stood, then a woman in a Marine auxiliary pin. Soon, half the room was rising. Veterans, sons and daughters of veterans, townspeople who had walked past Franklin for years without a second glance. Now they saw him, all of him. Judge Bennett rose slowly from a bench. The weight of what she was about to say pressed against her spine. "There is something I must disclose," she said, looking directly at Franklin. "Lieutenant Daniel Bennett was my brother." Franklin's breath caught. Her voice softened. "He wrote about a man who refused to abandon him, who carried him through smoke and gunfire. He said he never got a thank you, but I have spent 20 years hoping for the chance." She stepped down from the bench, and for the first time in her career, she crossed the space between judge and defendant. She stood before Franklin, one hand outstretched. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling, "for my brother, for the weeks we had with him, for the man you were when no one was watching." Franklin shook his head slowly. "He was a good man. I didn't do anything special." "No," she said gently. "You did something sacred." The courtroom was silent. Then a voice from the back, an elderly Marine, called out, "Attention on deck." One by one, everyone stood, saluted. Not just the Marines. Everyone, even the prosecutor, even the officer who had arrested him. And for the first time in decades, Franklin Hayes, the man once invisible on the steps of Jefferson Street Cafe, stood at the center of a room filled with open eyes, open hearts, and a truth no longer denied. The charges were dropped without ceremony. No one clapped. No one cheered. Because sometimes reverence doesn't need noise. It just needs presence. Later that afternoon, Franklin sat alone in a side room of the courthouse, the Navy Cross resting in his lap. Wren returned with paperwork. "The VA is reopening your file. They're issuing full back pay. Housing, healthcare, all of it. Retroactive." Franklin stared down at the medal. "I still don't understand how this happened." Wren smiled faintly. "Sometimes it only takes one voice to break the silence. Yours." That evening, Judge Bennett returned home and opened her brother's letters once more. She reread the one about Franklin, the smudged ink, the rushed scrawl, the way he wrote, "If I ever make it back, it'll be because of him." She placed the letter in a new frame. Beside it, she added a photograph, not of her brother, but of Franklin Hayes, standing in the courtroom that morning, not in chains, but in honor. The apartment was modest, 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and a view of the city's north side, but to Franklin Hayes, it felt like sanctuary. After years of concrete benches, shelter cots, and nights spent tucked beneath bridges, the warmth of 4 walls and the quiet hum of a functioning heater felt like a miracle. Not luxury, just peace. He stood in the doorway on his first night, taking it all in like a soldier scanning a field he never thought he'd walk again. The walls were plain, but freshly painted. A folded American flag rested on the shelf above the TV, beside a frame that would soon hold his photo, the first since Fallujah. On the table, a polished wooden box sat unopened, its engraved brass plate glinting softly. "For uncommon valor in combat, Navy Cross, United States Marine Corps." Franklin hadn't opened it yet. Not fully. He'd seen the medal once in the courtroom, felt the weight of it in his hand like someone else's legacy. But the idea that it belonged to him still hadn't settled. Not in his bones. That night, he didn't sleep on the bed. He sat beside the window in the old recliner donated by the VFW Post. Watched the streetlights flicker on. Listened to the silence. For the first time in years, no one told him to move along. 2 weeks passed before Judge Caroline Bennett appeared at his door. She wasn't in black robes. No bench, no authority. Just a navy blue coat, her hair swept back, and a shoebox held in both hands. Franklin opened the door cautiously, unsure what to call her now. "Caroline is fine," she said gently. He nodded. Then Franklin. They sat in silence at first. Him in the recliner, her on the edge of the couch. The shoebox between them. "I found these," she said, carefully removing the lid. Inside were letters, yellowed by time, their edges curled. Some envelopes were still sealed. Most bore the spidery script of a soldier in the desert writing by flashlight. "They're Daniel's," she said. "From Iraq." Franklin's breath hitched. She handed one over. April 20th, 2004. Fallujah outskirts. Franklin turned it in his hand as if, afraid it might fall apart. Then, slowly, he unfolded the letter. "Dear Caroline, it's strange how in the worst moments you see people the clearest. Yesterday, I saw a man run through gunfire to reach me. My side was torn open. I was shouting at him to go to save someone else. But he wouldn't. He said, 'We don't leave anyone.' Not today. He got me out, then went back in. Twice. His name's Hayes. Quiet guy. Carries himself like someone who's already buried a dozen friends. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. But if I make it home, it'll be because he didn't run. If I become half the Marine he is, I'll consider myself a success." Franklin didn't speak, but the letter shook in his hands. "It wasn't your fault," Caroline said softly. "He made it home for 2 weeks. That time meant everything to us." Franklin stared out the window. "For years," he whispered, "I thought maybe I just delayed it. That maybe if I hadn't pulled him out." Caroline placed her hand over his. "You gave us a gift," she said. "The chance to say goodbye. The chance to know who he became. And that he died trying to live like you." Franklin turned away. One hand covered his eyes. Not guilt. Relief. In the weeks that followed, the community changed around him. The small downtown diner where he used to wait by the back vent now reserved a table by the window with a tiny brass sign. Reserved for SGT. Hayes still standing. Veterans who once passed him silently now approached with quiet nods, some saluting. One day, a young father stopped him on the street. "My dad served in Ramadi," he said, voice shaking. "He said there were legends in the Corps. Hayes was one of them. I didn't know that was you." "Thank you." Franklin tipped his cap, the way old Marines do when words fail. He spent most mornings on the bench outside the community center, a different bench than the one he'd once been told to vacate. This one had a new plaque, in honor of those who waited for the world to remember them. Sometimes children sat beside him. They didn't know his story, but they liked the way he fed birds with broken crackers and said things like, "Courage is quiet. It doesn't wear medals. It wears scars." One afternoon, Caroline returned. She wasn't alone. With her was Tommy, Daniel's son, 17 now, dressed in his ROTC uniform, unsure of how to stand but trying. "I've told him about you," Caroline said. "He asked to meet you." Tommy stepped forward, eyes locked with Franklin's. "My dad. He used to tell me stories," the boy said, "about a Marine named Hayes. Said you were the reason I'm here." Franklin looked at the boy, the same dark eyes, same determined chin. He reached into the wooden box by the window and pulled out a different medal. One older, faded, a Purple Heart. "I want you to have this," Franklin said. The boy stepped back. I can't." "You can," Franklin said, "because this one carried pain. You carry legacy." Tommy took it. Tears rolled, but he stood straighter. Later that evening, Franklin sat at his table, looking at a framed photo Caroline had left behind. Daniel, smiling, arms around his sister, sunlight in his eyes. Beside it, Franklin placed his Navy Cross. Not for display, just for memory. He opened the last of Daniel's letters that night. "Mom, Dad, There's a man here who walks through hell like he's been through it twice. He never raises his voice, never boasts. But every young Marine in this battalion stands taller when he walks past. His name is Franklin Hayes. And I think someday someone will need to remember that name. Because names like his, they make the rest of us brave. Franklin sat long into the night. Not because he was haunted, but because, for the first time, he was finally at peace. By spring, Franklin Hayes had become part of the town's rhythm. Not a relic of the past, but a living chapter of its present. He no longer walked Main Street with his head lowered. The lines on his face hadn't faded, but something in his posture had shifted, no longer burdened by invisibility, but anchored in a quiet, earned pride. The bench outside Millstone Cafe, once a silent witness to cold nights and polite dismissals, now bore a brass plaque that read, "In honor of SGT. Franklin Hayes, because some battles don't end when the war does." Every morning, Franklin took his seat there like clockwork. Sometimes with a book, sometimes just watching the town unfold. School buses wheezing by, veterans from the VFW post walking in pairs, young families waving from across the street. But always someone stopped. A nod, a handshake, a quiet thank you. He didn't always respond, but he always looked him in the eye. That was enough. At the courthouse, just beyond the steps where he had once shuffled in chains, a portrait was unveiled. Not grand, not towering, just a simple oil painting of Franklin seated in uniform. No salutes, no weapon, just a folded cap in his hands, his gaze directed slightly left as though he were still, watching over someone not yet seen. The artist, a retired Navy wife named Margaret Dean, had painted it from memory after watching his hearing months earlier. He didn't strike a pose, she said. He just sat still, and you could feel history coming off of him like heat from stone. The portrait hung in the Veterans Court lobby beneath a placard. SGT. Franklin Hayes, United States Marine Corps. Vietnam, Iraq. A life of quiet valor. In late April, Franklin received a letter in the mail, hand-delivered by a Marine Corps liaison. It was from a teacher at Ashfield High School. Dear SGT. Hayes, my students are participating in a county-wide essay contest titled, "What Makes a Hero?" They've chosen you. We'd be honored if you came to speak to them. Mrs. Elena Moore, Social Studies Department. Franklin hadn't stood behind a podium since the days of field briefings. But something in him stirred. That Friday, the school gym smelled like floor polish and anticipation. Folding chairs were arranged in tidy rows. Banners lined the walls. Character, honor, integrity. Words students had seen for years, but perhaps never fully understood. Franklin stood behind a single microphone. No stage, just a small riser. He wore his uniform coat, the same one they'd found in a storage bin outside the VA years earlier. Cleaned, mended, buttons polished. The students didn't fidget. They didn't whisper. Something about his presence made them still. "I'm not a hero," Franklin began, voice gravelly low. "I'm a man who kept showing up." He let the words settle before continuing. "I've been young. I've been strong. I've also been forgotten. I've fought in 2 wars. I've seen brothers fall. I've carried men who never came home. I came back and lived years where it felt like the country forgot who I was." One of the teachers wiped at her eyes. "But I kept showing up," he said again. "Not because I had answers, but because I knew someone had to remember." He looked over the rows of young faces. "You want to honor veterans?" he said gently. "Start by seeing the ones who sit alone in diners. The ones who walk slow with heavy coats in July. Ask their name. Listen to their story. Because what we carry for you now." The silence after his final sentence was not empty. It was full of respect, understanding, and something deeper. Recognition. That week, dozens of essays poured in from local schools. One read, "He didn't tell us to be strong. He showed us what strength looks like when no one's watching." Another, SGT. "Hayes said he wasn't a hero. But I think sometimes heroes are just people who kept going even when the world stopped watching." Mrs. Moore compiled the essays into a small binder and delivered them to Franklin personally. He placed them on the shelf next to his medals. Right between the folded flag and his photo with Daniel Bennett. By summer, the local library added a digital kiosk at the Veterans Heritage Archive. On the screen, visitors could now search for Hayes, Franklin, Oral History Project. A 20-minute recording played, just Franklin, seated, recounting stories in his slow, thoughtful cadence. He didn't dwell on combat. He talked about the smell of diesel in Vietnam mornings, about sand in the boots of Fallujah, about the silence between explosions, the way time stretched. But mostly, he talked about memory. What stays with you, he said, isn't the medals. It's the sound of someone whispering, "I got you," when you don't think you'll make it out. The library reported that it became the most watched entry in their digital archive within 2 weeks. On Veterans Day, the town held a small ceremony in the square. Nothing grand, no flyovers, just a podium, some folding chairs, and a wreath. When Franklin's name was read aloud, no one clapped. They stood, one by one, the way soldiers stand for a flag being folded, the way people rise in church before a benediction. And Franklin, seated quietly in the front row, tipped his cap once. The only gesture he ever needed. One afternoon near Thanksgiving, Franklin visited Daniel Bennett's grave. He didn't speak. He just placed a small stone on the headstone, a tradition in some military units. A signal. I came back. I didn't forget. When he turned to leave, he found Caroline standing a few rows away. She wasn't surprised to see him. They didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "I still read his letters sometimes." "I do too," Franklin replied. Not out loud. Just, remember. She looked at him, then smiled softly. "He'd be proud of you." Franklin nodded. And I of him. That winter, someone painted a mural on the side of the Veterans Services building, silhouettes of 3 soldiers against the backdrop of an American flag. One of them was unmistakably modeled after Franklin, tall, quiet, standing slightly apart. His head turned, watching the others walk ahead. At the bottom, a quote was stenciled in deep blue letters. "I just kept showing up. SGT. Franklin Hayes." He didn't seek attention. He never wanted a stage. But by simply standing tall, not with defiance, but with dignity, Franklin Hayes gave a town back something it didn't know it had lost. Its memory. And every time he walked down Main Street, someone tipped their hat. Not because of his medals, but because they finally saw him. In today's fast-paced world, where attention spans are short and recognition often goes to the loudest voices, the story of Franklin Hayes speaks a quiet truth that cuts through the noise. Honor does not expire with time, nor does dignity vanish in the face of poverty or age. Franklin's journey, once a Marine, then a forgotten figure in his own hometown, reminds us that many of the men and women who have served our country return not to parades or prosperity, but to silence. Some sleep in shelters. Some are passed over in line. Others sit alone in parks, carrying memories that history books do not record. Their sacrifice, however, doesn't fade just because society looks away. The transformation of a town that once ignored Franklin into one that stood in full salute was not the result of legislation or headlines. It was the result of one person choosing to see him and choosing not to look away. That moment of recognition, when Judge Caroline Bennett realized the man in front of her was the same Marine who had saved her brother, became a turning point not just in the courtroom, but in the community's soul. In our own lives, the application is clear. We walk past veterans every day without knowing their stories. We see aging neighbors, quiet bus riders, or the man at the coffee shop who never quite fits in, and we make assumptions. But what if instead we paused? What if we asked their name? What if we treated them not as strangers, but as potential stewards of courage, resilience, and lived wisdom? We don't need grand gestures to make a difference. Sometimes it starts with a seat offered without judgment, a meal shared, a conversation initiated. Sometimes it's as simple as remembering that someone who seems invisible may have once risked everything for people they'll never meet, including us. Franklin Hayes didn't ask to be honored. He just kept showing up. And that's perhaps the greatest lesson, that the measure of a life is not in medals, but in consistency, in showing up with kindness when no one is watching, in standing tall, even when no one salutes. So the next time you see someone sitting alone with a far-off look in there, the next time you hear a name in the news followed by formerly homeless veteran, think of Franklin Hayes. Think of what happened when one town opened its eyes. And then, maybe, be the one who opens yours. Because legacy isn't something we inherit. It's something we choose to see. And dignity, once restored, has the power to heal us all.